has to be, if not an unprecedented experience, and I suspect it may be unprecedented, it surely is for me a very strange experience, not to say daunting, to be privileged to be invited to introduce Sherwin Wine in this room to this audience. It may be compared to being invited to introduce God to a choir of angels in heaven. I use the word God so rarely that I'm already uncomfortable. It would be ridiculous for me to tell you about Sherwin Wine's accomplishments, his publications. You know them. And if you don't, what in the world are you here for? So I won't review the long list of books and articles and other achievements that are well known to you. And if they're not, they should be, and you will, I'm sure, become acquainted with them very quickly. I won't review the long list of organizations that Sherwin Wine has founded. As we all have sat here these past 3 days, I'm sure that Sherwin has founded another 2 organizations. I first heard of Sherwin Wine and met him some 35 years ago in the mid-60s when I was an assistant rabbi at KAM Temple in Chicago, and my boss, Rabbi Weinstein, went away on sabbatical and left me in charge of this large congregation. And at the same time, I had heard about a crazy rabbi in the suburbs of Detroit who had all kinds of absolutely ridiculous, audacious, outlandish ideas. And I said, there's another person in the world who agrees with me. And I invited him to speak there, and we have been friends and colleagues and associates ever since. In fact, shortly after that, I began to do something that some of you may have heard about. Have you heard about traveling for the Rebbe? I began a process of traveling to the Rebbe here in Detroit. Several times a year, I would drive here to visit with Sherwin and to learn from him and to be inspired by him and to participate in his founding hobby with him. One of my first trips, it may have been the very first trip here, was, I believe, in 1967. I knew that Sherwin was famous by then. I knew that he was notorious. But let me tell you this. On our way from Chicago to Detroit, we were accompanied all the way by an armed cavalcade, by tanks, by trucks full of the National Guard. And as we reached Detroit, we were stopped at various checkpoints by soldiers with drawn rifles, asking us, where are we going? And I said, I'm going to see Sherwin Wine. And they said, okay, go. If you don't know the history of Detroit, you'll know that this was that famous period of the riots. And I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that. I thought they were all there welcoming me to visit Sherwin Wine. So I can't, other than that, share with you anything that you don't already know about Sherwin Wine, except 2 more things. And I'll try to make it brief. I want to tell you that were it not for Sherwin Wine, not only wouldn't I be here, nor any of you, but my congregation, Congregation Beth Or in the suburbs of Detroit, would be a conventional Reformed congregation.
Chicago, you're in Chicago.
Sorry, Chicago. Well, you are awake. Amazing. Because Sherwin helped me and helped the congregation through our crisis, an ordeal of conversion from Reform to Humanistic Judaism. Without his encouragement and support and inspiration and example, I don't think, would have been successful in that conversion process. So Sherwin is not only a founder, which is important, but possibly even more important, he is, and this word may sound foreign to some of you in association with Sherwin, he is a nurturer. He is an enabler. He is an encourager in the best sense of all of those words. So if that is not on his curriculum vitae, if those lists of adjectives, they should be added immediately. And the second secret information about Sherwin that I can share with you, some of you may already know it, is that he is immortal. I present to you with great pleasure the immortal Sherwin Wine.
I'm a great admirer of Dan Friedman because I'm a great admirer of courage. And when I met him, I knew that I had not only a good friend and a colleague, but there was somebody in my life who I strongly admired. And that applies to people sitting around this table whose courage certainly has made the message of a secular humanistic Judaism strong. By the way, in terms of recognition, I didn't know about the tanks stopping you. But I was taking my mother across the water to Windsor. That's in a country called Canada to the north. And we had... oh, it's to the south, right. Canada to the north. And you're... We got through the tunnel, and we got to the immigration and customs, and the man leans in the door and says to me, "Where were you born?" And my mother says, "Don't you know who this is?" No. With a mother like that, you could easily develop a God complex. Okay. This summer, I went to a place that I'd wanted to go to for a long time. I like to go to the zoos and watch the big animals, but I like to do people watching. And I went to this place because I wanted to see the people and the culture, and I had an experience there. The place is called West Africa. It's Senegal and Gambia and Mali and Niger and the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And I got there and I had an experience. I can only call it radical discontinuity. It's a long word, long phrase, but I was in a world which was just totally different in every way, shape, and form from my own. It was filled with farmers and shepherds wandering around in exotic costumes. It was filled with village after village after village with mud houses and thatched roofs. It was filled with incredible poverty where most people were struggling to survive at a survival level. It was filled with family compounds in which dozens of people lived for all practical purposes in one house, all one family. It was filled with female subordinates. The women do all the work. They carry and they schlep and they move. It was filled with chiefs, because the organization of every village was just like the family. It was modeled after the family. It was authoritarian. The chiefs inherited their jobs. And in fact, they were, for all practical purposes, the kings of the village. It was filled with muscles. You saw donkeys and plows and people pushing and shoving. It was filled with a lot of stability. You could see that nothing had changed for a long, long time, and there were very few options for people to choose from. It was filled with something else that everybody else felt, and I didn't. They wanted me to. All around, they told me there were spirits. And somehow they were ancestral spirits, and some of them were unfriendly spirits, and you had to be aware of them. It was a world in which the major coping strategy for people to survive in a world of such deprivation was religion. And it was a world of continuity, because the places I was looking at had been there the generation before, and the generation before, and the generation before. And I knew that if I had to stay there, if somebody said, Sherwin, here is your place, I had almost no skills for survival. I did not know. I know how to walk down Fifth Avenue and not bump into anybody. I know how to do that. I know how to shop in a department. I don't know how to survive there. And that's called radical discontinuity. So that's what the new Jew means. The new Jew is not only a choice. At the beginning of the century, there were those people who wanted to create a new Jew. But in the 20th century, a new Jew emerged that was different from what the planners may have had, because they weren't in charge of all the forces. But now virtually all the Jews of the world are experiencing in some way a kind of radical discontinuity with their past. Because the world I visited was a little bit like the world out of which the old Judaism, when it began, came. We now live, the new Jew lives in a world of the bourgeoisie and money. The new Jew lives in a world of big cities, whether it's New York or Tel Aviv or Haifa or Jerusalem or Detroit or Chicago. The new Jew lives in a world of affluence. It's not that there isn't poverty, but on the whole, the places where he lives are affluent places. The new Jew lives in a world in which families are not what they used to be. First they became nuclear families, and now we have this entity that was discussed during the colloquium. It's called the individual. Grows up to 18, is fed by his family, raised by his family, and then he what? Or she leaves and writes postcards from Seattle. The new Jew lives in a world now of feminism in which women are participating, maybe not as fully as they ought to, but are participating in a way in the culture that they certainly would not do down there in West Africa. It's a world now of democracy, because ultimately the new market economy and capitalism undermined and destroyed the management team, the authoritarian management team that was running the old world. And now we got this new thing. It's not chiefs, but this thing called democracy. It's a world of machines, not muscles. And it's a world of relentless change where everything becomes obsolete. Sometimes it's 2 years, and sometimes it's 6 months. It's a world in which, and it was described during the colloquium, I mean, the world is a supermarket. You go in and just to buy breakfast cereal, there are 250 options. It's a world in which we no longer sense the spirits. The reason why we're redefining spirituality is because it had a meaning historically. That meaning was tuning into the world of the spirit. And when you're in Africa, and you're in the sacred forest, and you watch the people in there, you know the world they're in. They are surrounded by their ancestral spirits, and they feel their presence, and they feel their power. And as Yaakov said, that's gone for most people. It's a world in which if we have to solve problems, we no longer pray. Even people who belong to Orthodox shuls, They solve their problems through human connections, and the new Jew lives in a world of radical discontinuity. A radical break with the past. The break in belief, the break in family relations, just the relationship of husband and wife and children. The break in technology, the break in education. The new secular education has almost nothing to do with the kind of religious education that went before. The break in work. The break in the expectations that we now have of life. The radical discontinuity between the conformity of the old and the freedom that we now have. That's one of the great themes of this colloquium. We have to deal with it. Ze'ev started us off on that theme. We now live in this huge supermarket. And we have to what? We have to choose. It's not the village. We have to choose, and we got to choose. And we have a new kind of anxiety. It's a radical discontinuity and anxiety. The old anxiety was, I live in the village. My anxiety is, will the people whom I know, will they approve of me or disapprove of me? Oh. Because if they disapprove of me, maybe they'll kick me out. But the new anxiety is, I'm living in a world of strangers. Are they safe? If I make this choice, is it a risk? I don't know. It's a whole new kind of anxiety. So now the issue becomes how we cope with it. And our coping is filled with two emotions. One is guilt, because there's always guilt when you abandon the ways of your fathers or mothers. I mean, that's it. You feel guilty because you can see them all standing behind you going. And there's fear. It's something new. Where is it going? Wouldn't it be nice if we went back? So we have various coping styles. There's a coping style of nostalgia. We talked about it in this weekend. The people that, maybe we just hang on, maybe we can go back. There's the coping strategy of hanging on. You sort of freeze. You hang on to as much of the past as you can, and you just keep moving, but you're sort of frozen, and pieces keep falling off as you move along. And that was modern orthodoxy and the conservative movement. All right. There's complaining. That's one of the major strategies. Complaining is, you change, your whole life changes, and then you sit around and you say, oh, what's happening? I can't stand it. I mean, I don't like it. I don't like the change. You mumble, you grumble and mumble. And the best skill that most people have for survival is complaining. One of the coping strategies is called nationalism. When religion is no longer feasible, a new religion emerges with flags and parades and songs and all those ideas. They're all over the place. My country. No, they changed that to oh say. That's right. Okay, fine. The nationalism. And in fact, Jews were not free of that. One of the ways to cope with a world in which individuals feel very, very vulnerable is to reconstruct a new family, much bigger, but it's called the family. It's the nation. I was always told, I saw George Washington on one wall and Abraham Lincoln on the other. I was American. Although since I was Jewish, I was only American. Okay, fine. And some people cope, and they still do that. Remember that spirit world I described to you? Some people say, I'm having trouble. If only there was just a little magic power lying somewhere. Just a little bit of magic power that I could tune into. Maybe if I sit and close my eyes, I'll contact it. Maybe somewhere out there is this magic power, and I'll find it. Now, the most provocative transformation that has occurred in this radical discontinuity has been one of the themes. It's that freedom. It's that personal choice. And in fact, in the 20th century, many people fled from it and supported regimes that didn't give you any because it terrified them. They're called Stalinism and fascism. But in the end, those regimes collapsed because in the end, people can mumble and grumble about personal freedom. In the end, Most people prefer it, even with all its headaches, and so we are not going back. Now, there was an interesting confusion that arose. I listened very carefully. By the way, I had an advantage. I could see the speakers from the rear. And it's an interesting view because you can really focus on the words that were said. So one of the things that was picked up is we want to live in a world in which people have free choice, free choice, free choice, free choice. Good. Well, if that's the case, then let people all go out and make their free choices. And why do you have to organize them in anything? What does it mean to have a philosophy of life? There is a distinction between my right to choose what I do and whether I have chosen the right thing. Do you understand? I see all kinds of people who freely choose substances that destroy them. Do you understand? They freely choose substances and behavior that destroy them. Do they have the right to do it? Well, yeah, right. Ought they to do it? No. Right. And we get all confused between right. I'm very intrusive with people I love. If they're destroying themselves, I don't mind saying to them, I don't think you ought to do that. I don't dispute their right to make the choice, but I also have the right to nudge. I learned that early in my life. I care, and if people care, they do intrude, they do nudge. They should not have the power to tell other people what to do unless they are harming others. But all of us, that's what it means to be in a society. We care. And if you care, then we're all offering in some way, either through behavior or word or whatever, some kind of guidance. And it's not easy to do guidance because we're negotiating at all times, and this applies to everybody. 3 agendas. We have what's called the prudential agenda. What is good for me, my pleasure, my dignity, my satisfaction, my fulfillment? Thank you. Then we have the ethical one. The ethical one, because the vocabulary of ethics arises out of living in a group. There wouldn't be any ethics if there weren't other people around. Ethics is what is the right thing that will enhance the welfare of my community, my group. Oh, well, that isn't always compatible with what's good for me. And then we've got the third agenda, which is called the compassionate agenda. And that's not often easy to understand because people equate that with the ethical, but let me give you an example since I teach classes. I've been many times in a class where one student can take up all my time. And then I will neglect the other 25 students in the class. If I choose to be compassionate and neglect the other, do you understand, the other students, then I work with the what? With the one. And sometimes you have to make a decision on behalf of the group that you have. The ethical decision is different from the compassionate. There are 3 agendas here. It's prudential, ethical, compassionate, and we're all negotiating. It isn't that finding a little answer in a book. What is memorizing an answer? What does that have to do with how we live? That isn't how we make decisions. So, what is humanistic Judaism? That's what I want to sort of summarize secular humanistic Judaism for me. And I listen very, very carefully, and as I go down what I'm going to go down, I'm going to address the issues that have been picked up in this colloquium. I believe that humanistic Judaism is a guide to making choices. Every day of our life, we are what? Making choices. So this is how we make choices. One, by the way, I have about 13, but And I was thinking Maimonides had 13 principles of the faith, so I was thinking of shortening it to 12, and I may do that along the way. Yeah, all right. Guideline 1. Choose an alternative you believe in. If you're going to join something, some community, some Jewish community, choose something you believe in. The great problem with reform in the end of the 19th century, we heard about what happened to the reform movement. The Reformed Jews chose an alternative. We're not nationalists. We're not a nation. We are a religious denomination. Except that most of them, and Yaakov pointed that out, were atheists. They didn't really believe. And you can't build an alternative around the importance of the one sovereign creator, God, unless you what? You believe. And that's one of the things that we as secular humanistic Jews can give to people in an age of this atheism, whether articulated or not articulated. This is a place where you can believe in what is said. 2, do not hang in limbo. I heard a lot of discussion about people who are attached to language. Oh, I'm used to this. I mean, Mordecai Kaplan was a Litvak with an attachment to 3 Ds. Dewey, Durkheim, and davening. And John Dewey, the philosopher, Emil Durkheim, the great sociologist from France, and davening. And he loved that language. And can I find some way of keeping it? Not. Sometimes in life, you cannot have your cake and eat it. So, the principle that I'm articulating, the guideline for choice is, say it the way it is. Say it in English. Say it in Hebrew. Say it in Yiddish. There are all those words. If you're talking about goodness, say goodness. If you're talking about love, say love. You don't need God, divine. You don't need that. And when you do it that way, it is a kind of liberation. All of a sudden, you're the master of your words. You are no longer the slave. You have a certain kind of integrity. 3, do not wait for the perfect choice. Let me point out, and I hear this all the time, freedom has many disadvantages. People make a lot of bad choices. So maybe what we need is a world in which that freedom is curtailed because so many bad choices are being made. And what people are looking for is that alternative that has no disadvantages. It's like intermarriage. Well, if we allow it, maybe the Jewish people will shrink. But on the other hand, if we disallow it, how are we treating the people who are in love and relationships and people who may be non-Jewish who deserve our respect? We're always weighing these things. So in life, I always say, if I get 60% advantages and 40% disadvantages, do you understand? I'll make the choice. And so I don't sit always on this fence, unable to move, because I will not move until I have the perfect solution. Guideline 4, remember the individual. One of the problems of nationalism, whether it's American nationalism, Canadian nationalism, French, Israeli, doesn't make any difference, Jewish. One of the problems of nationalism is that it is collective. And collectivism is always asking the question, which my rabbi used to do from the pulpit. Sherwin, what have you done lately for the Jewish people? Well, what have you done for your group? But sometimes I wanted to hear the question, well, maybe addressed to the Jewish people. What has the Jewish people, that's an important question, by the way, and Judaism done for me? I'm a person. I'm living in this stressful world. I've got all these needs. I'm trying to get through life, and I'm having a hard time, and I need some help. And all you keep talking about is the group. Why don't you talk about me? And I want to tell you that if a secular humanistic Judaism is going to survive in any significant way, it cannot simply have an agenda about culture, the people, history. It has to have a philosophy of life that addresses the individual. In Israel now, I was in India 2 years ago. To the left of me were Israelis, to the right of me were Israelis, to the north of me were Israelis, to the south of me were Israelis. They were rushing, they were picking up gurus, ashrams, gurus. Zionist nationalism was insufficient. It did not address their individual needs. And now they're searching. And you can mock them and laugh at them, but they're searching. The strongest alternative liberal religion in Israel is not secular humanistic Judaism. It's all this New Age religion everywhere you go. What have we to say to people who are dying, to people who are ill, to people who are having family problems, to people who feel disillusioned with their lives? What do we have to say? 5, rescue what is rescuable. We had a long talk about ethnicity here, and there was the discussion about ethnicity. Jack discussed it, Dan discussed it. But what is very, very clear, that overwhelmingly in the United States of America, if you're talking about it, and in Western Europe, Jews are becoming rapidly de-ethnicized. In order to be ethnic in America, really ethnic, you have to be visible. If you have a distinct language, you're visible. If you have distinctive clothing, you're visible. Once you give up your language and your clothing, then all that survives is something called race. And so the people who are truly ethnic in America are African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, because no matter what they do with their language, whatever else it is, ultimately they are confronted with the fact that their appearance places them in another category. But Jews have now joined the new ethnic group that emerged after World War II. It's called white. And if that's the case, if we can't rescue the ethnicity outside the Jewish state in any significant way, then what we're talking about is a new kind of cultural Jew in the diaspora. It may not be a person who is ethnically self-aware, but it may be a person who can still feel very strongly rooted in and connected to the history and elements of the culture of the Jewish people. I call that the historical Jew. It was a word used in the 19th century for another purpose. 6, stop expecting any magic power. When I was in West Africa, I did go to see a fellow clergy person. I was interested in picking up a few new tricks. Why not? And in Ghana, I went to see a Konfi, a voodoo priest, and it was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot that I haven't yet tried out here at the Birmingham Temple. He went into a trance for me. What I wanted from him was something for eternal youth. And guided by his spirit, he ran into the sacred forest, and he came back with a root, which I have in a brandy bottle, which I can sip every morning. So just a little. And by the way, if you want to borrow my bottle, you can. Well, I think spirituality, when it began, was connection to the spirit world. That's why we have the word. But now, obviously, in the age of atheism, we can redefine it. And in fact, spirituality is indeed art and its symbols, but there are people who have spiritual experiences without symbols. They're relating to the sun and the moon and nature and whatever. They may be relating to other people in some significant way. Art is part of the total picture of what we are now describing by this word, and I think that's very, very significant. But in the end, there is no magic power. And if we choose to use the word spirituality, we are talking about something else, because nothing is more dangerous. I heard elements of magic power here, this colloquium. The infinite sea of wisdom. Somewhere there is a what? An infinite sea of wisdom. Oh. Someplace, I don't know where. There it is. 7, do not play God. And I have to take that seriously, okay. It's the great shift. We started out with God out there. And now we've ended up in the age of New Age religion with a God what? Well, and that's all right if it's what I would call a hesitant God, a timid God, a God that says, I think I have an opinion. Don't take me entirely seriously. But if I have a God inside of me that says to me, Sherwin, I am your truth and I am your way, and you must listen to me, then I got the God from out there has now what? Is inside of me and is just as dangerous for me, because then I lose any kind of contact with how I get to the truth. And I mentioned this in the discussion. Truth comes from what? This interrelationship of my experience and your experience. It is something social. That is what the empirical method is. 8, do not play the prophet. By the way, and I heard the word prophetic used, and I want to share something with you because I have difficulty reading or enjoying the prophets in the Bible. Whenever I run every 105th sentence, I run across an ethical statement. It's fine. And some of the statements are ambiguous, like, love good, hate evil. Well, does anybody go around saying love evil, hate good? I don't know. But then they get more specific. There are social ills they address. But there are 3 things about the prophetic mentality that always bothered me because it took up all the other verses. One was their incredible self-righteousness. They knew they had the truth. The second was the vengeance. What would happen to their enemies if they didn't listen to their message? And the third, which is what I want to relate to, is the utopianism. The idea that once that judgment day came, maybe after that final catastrophe, what would happen? Everything would be beautiful and perfect. And one of the problems we faced in this century was the utopianism of so many of the new movements, of the new Jew, that promised more than they could deliver. And one of the things that we have to be able to do in our day is to soften the promise. It's to be able to say, we live in a difficult world, there are no utopias, and we may be able to improve it, but we can't solve all the problems. 9, do not put Jewish survival first. When I talk to a couple that's intermarrying, and I do a lot of intermarriages, I respect people who love each other, and I respect non-Jews as persons, and I do not wish to treat them as labels. It violates my ethical sense. And I will not say to you and find excuses and say, well, intermarriage does not interfere with the survival of the Jewish people. Remember those difficult choices I mentioned to you? You have advantages and what? And disadvantages. But quite frankly, if in order to be Jewish, I have to become a closed, parochial, and insensitive person, if that's the price I have to pay, It's too high a price. I had this argument with orthodoxy, with ultra-Orthodox Jews that say, we are the path for Jewish survival. I said, fine. Certainly it is true, if you want to talk about a saving remnant, a group of people who isolate themselves and segregate themselves and have no connection with other people will indeed survive. But what kind of people are we talking about? So I have never, Jewish survival to me is important, but it's not first. 10. Save all good things. You know, people go around and say, why should I be Jewish? Why should I be Jewish? Why should I be Jewish? And Manny said, well, I love it. And that's a great answer, by the way. But I've always enjoyed being Jewish not because of the advice I got from the past. I enjoy being Jewish because there's a mood that filled the Jewish community that was never fully articulated in any way in the Siddur, in the Bible, whatever. It came out of the Jewish experience. It's that mixture. And I don't want to lose the connection with it because it reinforces my humanism. It's that mixture of defiance in the face of a world that has treated us unjustly, and that good humor its good humor is to recognize the absurdity of the world, that mixture of defiance and humor. I don't want to lose my Jewish connection because it enriches my life. 11, value what you use. Somebody the other day said to me, you know, I want to reconnect to the Bible. So he's been reading the Bible, and then he says to me, it's like homework. And let me just point out to you, some people read the Bible and they what? It sends them. And one of the realities of Jewish life is that most Jews, most of the time, if they're choosing their reading, don't read it. And it's not only because they're boors. It's because there's alternative reading, often alternative Jewish reading, written by Jewish authors that what? Relates to them, and then they're told to feel guilty. I mean, I read the Song of Songs, and, you know, leaping over the hills like a gazelle, my love, it's not my cup of tea. But give me Roshi Roshi by Yehuda Amichai, and I'm, you know, my head, not mama, not God, do you understand? Give me your hand, yadech, yadech. And I'm just filled with the power of it. Is it Jewish yet? See, my recommendation always is connect in whatever way you can. Do you understand? With that body of Jewish literature and history. For some of us, it will be the what? The Tanakh. For some of us, it will be modern literature. Wherever you have that connection, that's what's important. 12, touch the heart. That's what Yaakov talked about. Let me talk about a false dichotomy. Reason and emotion. All action is motivated by emotion, our needs. Reason is the guide that helps us discipline our emotions because our emotions are in conflict with each other. The conflict is not between reason and emotion, the mind and the heart. The conflict is between prose and poetry. Sometimes we need prose and sometimes we need poetry, and we need lots and lots of poetry. And I want to thank Marcia. We need that poetry in our lives. And in fact, that's the great challenge to us. And last, be open, be human. I do want to tell you that the philosophers that made me a humanist, and I hesitate to say this, were not Jewish. I mean, I read Bertrand Russell, and I loved him. I read Jean-Paul Sartre, and I loved him. I read Albert Camus, and I loved him. I read George Santayana, and I loved him. And in fact, It was wisdom to me. It came into my heart. And when I said that once to a rabbi, he got very, very angry. Well, there are books by Jews that you... I said, I know there are. But does that mean my heart and mind are closed? That's the balancing act. Oh. If I choose to be closed, I become less than a humanist. If I choose to be open, there's always the risk that I'm going to be sucked into what? That outer world, and that's the balance. There's the cosmopolitan. There is my Jewish ethnicity. I mean, we're balancing the two together. Pluralism has no meaning if I simply say, well, you have the right to your opinion. Pluralism only has meaning if it says, you have a different opinion from mine. Can I hear it? And so the new world is going to be one of what I call fluid boundaries. Well, you've heard of the halakha. We have a little song that we sing in this community. It goes like this. Ma haderech, what is the way? Haderech derech shel emet. The way is the way of truth. You can't get your handle on reality if the choices you make in life drive you away from the truth and from reality. Ma haderech, what is the way? Haderech shel kavod. The way of honor and dignity. And if I give up my freedom, no matter how risky my freedom is, where is my dignity? And any Judaism that would ask me to do that deprives me of my full humanhood. And finally, and it's a message that I often articulate, in an absurd world in which there is evil as well as good and everything doesn't work out always the way we deserve, in a world of frustration, stress, and problems, what we need is ometz lev, is courage. Ma haderech, haderech, derech shel ometz lev. What is the way? It is the way of courage. Thank you very, very much.